thank you for joining us if you're here live. And if you're watching on the replay, perhaps you could let us know if you're here and you're watching. If you could put a hashtag live in the comments, that would be great. And then if you're watching on the replay, hashtag replay. We're, as you can see, we're going live using StreamYard. This is the first time that I've done this, so just put that out there. It's the first time that I've used StreamYard. It's the first time that I've done a video with somebody else. And I've got ADHD, so the likelihood that something might go wrong is quite high. But we do have the wonderful Steph in the background helping us out with the tech, so hopefully she'll keep us all on track. I know that it might take a few moments for people to find us, know that we're going live and to join us. So just while we're waiting for that to happen, oh, I can see that Janet's joined us. No, Janet, it just says Facebook user. So I think you need to go and give permission to StreamYard just to show your name, and it only takes a second. There should be a link. I don't know if there's a link in the chat. No. So, Steph, do you know whether there's a link that we can put in? Oh, great. I think Steph's going to put the link into the chat. So if anyone else could do that as well, if you haven't already given StreamYard permission to show your name, it's actually really nice for us to be able to see who it is that we're talking to, and rather than that Facebook user. So that would be great if you could do that, and it only takes a second or two. So I thought I'd first of all, I just while we wait for more people to join, just talk a little bit kind of housekeeping stuff to do with the group and myself. I know most people who are in the group do already know me, but I think there might be quite a few people who haven't seen me before. So just very quickly, I'm AJ Harman. I was diagnosed with ADHD and autism just under 2 years ago. And before that point, I really knew nothing about those conditions at all. So it's been a really steep learning curve ever since then. And I've become more and more determined to help other late diagnosed adults to kind of find their community and feel at home, people they can share with and feel supported with. So hence why I set up this group, and why I'm now a coach and a mentor and a writer working within neurodivergent circles. So I set up this group back in December 2021. And it's kind of steadily growing. And one of the things I've always wanted to do for this is to have people in the group who, we've got a whole range of amazing kind of expertise and knowledge that we could draw on. So I really wanted to have people in the group to be able to come and do things like this, do lives or write blogs and things like that, and kind of share some of their knowledge. And also to have guests come in. And so this is the first one. Obviously, it's taken me, I've got ADHD, it's taken me a little while to get it organised and to do it. But I'm very thankful that Dr. Mandy Barnett has agreed to be our first one. And hi, Janet. Yes, we can see you now. We've got your face, so we can see your name. That's lovely. Thank you. So I think that's about it. Hopefully other people will join as we go along, but I think, shall we get started? Shall I introduce you? So obviously this is Mandy. Mandy's a retired doctor. Were you a GP, Mandy? I know you worked.
No, I was a consultant in adult end-of-life care. I had a Macmillan team in our hospital, and I was also a member of the teaching faculty at Warwick Medical School. So I taught medical students communication skills and medicine related to end-of-life care, and I also helped. I was the person in charge of the final written examinations, so I had a lot to do with the examination process, which has kind of informed some of the bits of the book, and a lot to do with communication skills and communication between doctors, patients, and between patients and families. That was primarily, apart from the medical part, that was what I worked with, was trying to help people sort of optimize quality of life when they had incurable illnesses. And obviously that's nothing to do with what we're about here, but perhaps it informs my interest in medicine, was kind of like as much to do with people and their psychological makeup as it was to do with the medical part.
Yes, yeah. And that's so important, isn't it? That kind of the communication between all the different elements around, around that. And so you've got 2 children with Tourette syndrome, which is how we come to be doing this Q&A. And so during lockdown, you decided to write a guidebook for parents of children with Tourette syndrome. And it's just been published just recently, hasn't it? That's on Amazon at the moment. And I think there's a link. I think Steph will put the link, in the comments. It's also in the group as well. I've already put that in. And this is the book. It's not all about swearing. And it's a really good read, actually. I mean, obviously, it's incredibly informative. You obviously you really know your stuff, and you must have done a lot of research as well. But it's also just it's written so that it's very easily read, if that makes sense, and entertaining as well. So you've come to talk to us about the book, but also about Tourette syndrome in general, about what it's like to be a parent of children with Tourette syndrome, and anything, I guess, that people would like to ask around that. I thought, just to get us started, maybe you could just tell us about what prompted you to write the book in the first place.
Well, I think the thing was, I during and after lockdown, I was kind of thinking of what sort of project could I do, and everyone thinks they've got a book in them, and I was thinking of writing a book, but I hadn't actually decided what to write it about. And it was actually just when I was getting started on various ideas for drafts, and I got a list of possible titles and subtitles and ideas, and it was actually a friend of mine who said, "Have you seen in the press that there has been a huge spike in cases of Tourette's reported in the UK, in Europe, and both new cases and also worsening of people who have a known diagnosis? But specialists in Tourette's are getting huge numbers of referrals compared to what they would normally expect, and it appears to be linked to the increased mental stress that obviously everybody has felt during the course of the pandemic, and particularly during the first lockdown, because kids were not able to go to school, were under huge stress, their parents were under huge stress, and there was a lot of anxiety, and that seemed to have provoked it. And that was when I started thinking, well, maybe that could be what I write about. And then what really did it, as I started writing it primarily from a personal perspective and writing about my own kids. And then it was actually my daughter, who's part of an online support group for teens with tics and Tourette's. And she said that she was getting, a lot of the kids on that were kind of like, really struggling. And she and I decided to do an online survey to find out how they felt and see if that could be part of the book. So we put together a series of about 30 questions, put it into the group server, and there's about 100 in the group at the time. We didn't have a vast number of responses, but the ones who did respond had a lot to say. And really what came across to me was that how much these kids were struggling, but in particular how much they were struggling at home and at school. And long before the pandemic, some of them, their tics had developed during the pandemic, but most of them had actually had tics going back a while, and a lot of them weren't diagnosed. And a lot of them, their parents or carers either didn't believe them or didn't take it very seriously. And I think that's what really struck me, because I just assumed that other people's families dealt with it the same way we had. And I realized that we were not the exception, but we were by no means the rule.
Yeah.
There were kids coming in basically saying, I mean, there's one that I put in the book. I just thought it was so sad. This lad said, I try and suppress the tics until I get to school. I thought,
yes, I saw that one. That is sad.
Ticking at school than he did at home.
Yeah.
And someone else said they hid in their bedroom and put a towel against the door so that their families couldn't hear them. And another kid said her mum told her to stop making fun of people with Tourette's.
Yeah.
And you just think that is so sad. And especially because one of the people that I discuss in the book, who's now very well known in his own workplace, and he's Canadian. He had a similar experience, that he wasn't diagnosed, his family didn't support him, and he tried to commit suicide when he was in his teens. And you think, actually, we know that suicide in teens is one of the prime causes of death in that age group after accidents. And this is a very vulnerable group, because, and especially if they do feel isolated both at home and at school.
Yeah.
So that's really what prompted the book. And then I started to research it more, having got the sort of personal side of it. I thought, okay, because I come from a medical background, I wanted to make sure that everything I put in it was evidence-based. So, while obviously I talk about things that are happening to us personally and that these other kids have reported, anything that I actually stated, as a fact or as a sort of something that is happening, I wanted that to be evidence-based. So I then started researching it formally. And obviously that's where my medical background comes in, because I know how to look and what to look for. And so I could get a balanced sense of and I just wanted people to be able to say, well, if I want to look at this, and if I want to know why you said that, can I look it up? So that's why I've got a fairly exhaustive reference list at the back of the book, plus sources that are reliable in terms of other sources. So websites, I've mostly referenced the charities in the UK and internationally, because they are sources of reliable information. Because there's a lot of dross out there, and it's making sure that if people do want to look stuff up, they can find the right stuff.
Yeah, that's so important. I think just going back as well to what you were saying about how you had the input from actually children and teenagers, young people with Tourette's. That was one of the things I really loved about the book, actually, the fact that you've got the quotes dotted through. And I think it's so important to give people a voice, isn't it? It's the same, I know, from an ADHD perspective and an autistic perspective as well, that not being misunderstood or not being believed or just not having a voice is it's awful, and it's so anxiety making, stressful, and it's no wonder that children are suffering in that way. So I really love that you did that. I wondered actually what your children thought about the book and about the fact that you were writing the book.
Well, when I started it, they didn't. Well, they sort of just knew I was writing something. I think as I went on, I had to be, because my son's at uni and he'd gone back to uni by the time I was actually kind of like, he wasn't part of the writing process, but I sent him a draft. So I wanted to make sure that he was happy with what I'd said about him.
Yeah.
Because I put in quite a lot of things about especially in the early stages when we didn't know what was going on, and I wanted to make sure that, because whereas my daughter was more involved with the process, so she knew what I was writing about, whereas he didn't, and I wanted to make sure that he was okay with the various things I'd quoted about him, which he was, which is good. I'm not sure what I've done to edit it, because I've gone through so many edited versions by then. But no, he was quite happy with it, and I think there were a couple of things he wanted to add in, but he didn't want to take anything out, which was good.
Yeah.
And likewise with the kids who contributed, what I did was, as one of the questions that I asked them in the survey was, are you happy for me to quote you directly? And if so, can you give me a name that I can refer to, just a first name, to anything you want, so I can acknowledge you, and also that I can attribute the comments to you. So there were a few quotes where I put them in the table because the individual did not want to be identified. So in those instances, I just put them in as part of a table. Whereas all the ones who were happy to be quoted, which was most of them. I mean, I think there was only a couple who didn't want to be quoted by name. Most of them were quite happy and gave me a name, which is why I've been able to acknowledge them and attribute each quote to them.
Yeah, that's great. I'm just going to have a look through the chat and see if we have any questions. If anyone would like to ask anything, please feel free to write in the chat. Janet's written, loving this interview. Mandy is an amazing person. Her own story and her book are fascinating. That's lovely. Thank you, Janet. One thing I was just wondering while we wait and see if anybody else is going to... sorry, I've just noticed. So we've got a question actually from Stephanie saying, what are your top tips for managing offensive tics? My son shouts balls and Uranus a lot at the moment, and I just tend to ignore it. Oh, great. Let's put it up on the screen.
Okay, I mean, the thing with offensive tics, which are usually swearing and are usually copulalia, you can get others which are not appropriate but are not swearing. So things like sort of racist slurs or homophobic slurs can also come out, and I think often the problem with those, especially with an older child, is that they can be taken to be deliberate. Particularly because they often come out in the context where someone is around that could be interpreted as such. So it's very difficult for the child to actually say it wasn't, just because I saw someone who was black, I'm not being racist about them. But that often will provoke it, because it's because they're trying not to say anything that something will then pop into their heads, which is exactly the opposite of what they want to say. And I gave an example in the book like that, which was a family going to Germany and terrified that their kids were going to tick Nazi and Hitler, which in fact the kids did, but it didn't matter because they were in a theme park that was full of kids shouting. So in answer to Stephanie, in answer to the question, I think what you can't do is you can't stop them doing it. I think there are two things. One is if when you're at home and it doesn't matter, probably the best thing is just to ignore it, or just to kind of acknowledge it but not make a big deal of it. With our daughter, as she's got older and she's more self-conscious, she's developed, what she's been able to do is she'll disguise it. So if she can feel a sweary tick, and they don't always know it's going to be swearing, but if she can feel a sweary tick, she will sniff or cough. So instead of going shit, she goes shit.
Disguise it.
Now that was a problem in the pandemic, but in general, that it means that she doesn't have to try and suppress, which can be much harder. So she sort of lets it out, but she sort of diverts it. I think with younger kids, where obviously they don't tend to have the same degree of embarrassment, it can be harder. And I think in that instance, the most important thing is to make other people, if you can, around them aware that it is involuntary, that they are not doing it to be offensive. And one of the things that Angelica does herself, and we know a lot of other kids out there who've now done this, is they carry a lanyard that says, "I have Tourette's, please be patient." So if someone, hears them say something or wonders why they're doing an odd movement, they can then sort of, say, this is why. I think where it can be very difficult is if you've got, obviously a young teen who's starting to go out by themselves, and they've got a sweary tic because they might be in the street and they might say something that might be picked up either by an adult and taken as an offence, or by other teens and taken as being provocation. Now, one example I have observed, which was basically of parents taking their child to meet the local police. So they look, where you've got, obviously it's not difficult in a big city, but in a sort of smaller community, a village or a small town, they went to their local police station. They met the community support police officers so that they could actually demonstrate, what their kid does.
Yeah.
They could meet him and they could talk to him and realise that, when he shouted swear words at them, he was actually, not meaning it. Yeah. And they could not only observe that in him, but they could also then support him, so that if not only would they not get cross with him, but if for example somebody said, I've got, there's a kid swearing at me, and that they could say, no, we know him, and it's actually part and parcel of this condition. Yeah. I think one of the things is most kids, even if they have coprolalia, it does come and go. It's a relatively small number where the coprolalia itself persists. So it's relatively rare, but it's also it's not uncommon for it to happen, but it's uncommon for it to stay persistent.
Uh-huh.
So I mean, Angelica will have a sweary tic, and then a month or so later it's gone. Yeah. It's only in a few where the swearing becomes a persistent part of their tic pattern, and then even then the actual what they say will vary. Uh-huh. So some more offensive than others.
Yes, because I think you said earlier when we were talking that one of the definitions of it being Tourette's is that it has to change over time, so the tics gradually change into different ones.
Yes. So something that has, and that applies to movement as well as vocals. So, somebody might have a very painful tic, because some of the tics, will cause them to really contort, which is very distressing and can hurt them. And that was really what led us to realizing that our son had Tourette's, because his very first tic was a very subtle one. It was just blinking, and then he got a tic where he threw his arm out and at the elbow, so he was hyperextending his elbow, which was painful, and he couldn't stop doing it. And that's when I realized it was completely involuntary. And in that sort of situation, you just hope it will go away, and usually after a while it will be replaced by something else. But often what replaces it will be completely different. They don't tend to sort of, each tic is standalone. Yeah. The other thing is that when the tics tend to sort of peak in the early to mid teens. Mm-hmm. So often the very early tics may present, middle to late primary school is often. They might have other signs of Tourette's, which will tend to focus more on the sort of ADHD sort of element of it. So difficulties concentrating, and quite often something called rage attacks, which is where they will suddenly get very angry, and it might be shouting, it might be not swearing as a tic, but just being really angry, and being impulsive behavior, and then it calms down, and they don't know why they did it. It tends to be when they're tired. So with our son, it was when he came back from school at the end of an early primary school day when he was young, and it was a struggle getting through primary school, and often the tics start emerging around the ages about more like sort of 8 or 9. They can present earlier, but it's usually about 8 or 9, and then they get more and more clear cut as they get older, and they tend to get more frequent, and they tend to get more bouts. But one of the things I think people really misunderstand is that the tics in Tourette's are not there all the time, and they tend to occur in groups. So what will happen is somebody might have not tic for, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, usually hours, and then they might have a series of tics that all go off at once for a period. And what tends to bring it on is either stress, anxiety, tiredness, will all provoke them, and then they'll sort of settle down again. Some kids tic when they're actually in bed. Majority, it tends to sort of settle down and they can get to sleep, but there are a few kids that actually tic when they're trying to get to sleep, and that can obviously be very difficult for them. And then it tends to peak alongside puberty, whether it's the hormonal stuff or whether it's just that they're under more stress because they're at secondary school. It does seem to go alongside it, and then for most of them it will start to tail off when they're in their late teens. Our daughter's case, it's actually got more sort of mid to late teens, and that was one of the reasons why although she'd already got a diagnosis of tic disorder, that's why we actually pressed to get her properly diagnosed with Tourette's, because we foresee that she may be a group that has it slightly more severely going into adulthood. Whereas son, his tics have almost faded away.
Okay, so just bringing you back to that, what actually is the difference between kind of tic disorder and Tourette syndrome?
It's really a classification. It's basically tic disorder is a spectrum, and at one end you might have somebody with a single stable, facial tic, the sort of kind of or blinking, whatever.
Yeah.
Which is often anxiety based. Then you get people who might have a vocal tic. But the point with Tourette's is that to have a diagnosis of Tourette's, they have to have both motor tics, movement based tics, and vocal tics. And they have to change over time, and they have to have been present as a combination for at least a year. So you can't diagnose Tourette's in less than a year. It has to be present for a year. So I think that's to stop it being overly diagnosed, and it's also to give a sort of sense of where it's going. So when our son first had his blinking tic, that would not constitute Tourette's. When he got the blinking tic and he started squeaking, that became more likely. When he had the blinking tic, the elbow and the squeaking, and it went on for more than a year, that's when he could be diagnosed.
Yeah. And so do they tend to have the different categories of tics are happening at the same time? I mean, you said they change over time, but is there usually kind of movement and vocal kind of at the same time?
Yes. And also they can be what's called simple or complex. So a simple tic is where a simple movement tic would be something where somebody literally just does.
Yeah.
That would be a vocal tic, because it's actually, although that you can see movement, it's actually through the respiratory, or
it's a sound.
That's a sound. A movement tic, a simple movement tic, would be somebody blinking, for example, or a slight grimace could also be a movement tic. A complex tic is what people associate with Tourette's, which is when somebody actually, says a whole word or a sentence, which doesn't have to be obscene in any way, just anything. I mean, Angelica's kind of said all sorts of things. She'll kind of like just go lemon, or cheese and biscuits. That it's just a phrase but it's complex because what they say is complex. It's a whole phrase, or and sometimes it might be a whole sentence, which is why it sounds so organized. Or a complex movement might be, one of the things that Angelica does when she's ticking is if there's a pen on the desk, she'll pick it up and throw it.
Yeah.
And it looks like it's deliberate because she picks it up and throws it, but it is a tic. So one of the YouTubers who's very well known, she throws coffee.
Oh gosh.
So she has real difficulty in getting a cup of coffee at a takeaway and actually getting it to her mouth. And that can be dangerous.
Yeah.
One of the things I talk about is actually keeping safe, and there are practical things that you might need to do for a particular tic at any one time. Which is that if somebody throws a cup of hot coffee, you can break the cup and you can get scalding coffee over yourself or somebody else. So it's that side of it, and that's so the more organized and the more complex the movement or the sound, that sort of differentiates it into complex tics. You can have a single complex tic, but the more combinations you get, the more likely it is you got full-blown Tourette's. And the point as people get older, as the children get older, the tics tend to get more complex, more organized. But they also change, and that's the other key thing. Is that one of the things that Angelica talks about is that she has what she calls scattering days, and she will go through a phase where literally it's like her brain's looking for a new tic. So she might have a whole series of different words that kind of come in and out of focus, and then at the end of a day or a week, she'll have settled on a new tic. And she won't know which one it's going to be.
No, that's a kind of unconscious process, I guess, that it's happening without her really realizing exactly what's happening. It is really complex, isn't it? Because I know tics are also a part of ASD and ADHD as well, to a certain extent. So it must be quite difficult to start with if you've got a child who has tics, actually working out what it might be. Is there a particular, is it a case of just taking them to be assessed and have a professional assess what it is?
Well, one of the things that I advise people to do is if you observe something that you think could be a tic, is make a note of when it starts, make a note of what it is. If you can, make a video of it, obviously appropriately, so that you could actually show it to somebody. Because the other thing is that it's always going to be the sod's law. If you take a child to a doctor, they're not going to tic while they're there. So you actually need to say, this is what they're doing. They tend to be, especially a child who's maybe just starting to develop it, it tends to be worse at home because it's often when they're tired at the end of a day. So they may not be obviously ticking when they first set off in the morning, but it's when they get home from school and they've been, particularly younger children don't tend to suppress. So they may have been letting it out during the day, but they may have been suppressing if people have been telling them to shut up. They may not quite know how to suppress, but they'll have been sort of trying not to, or trying to. So often it comes out more at home, and the more comfortable they are at home, and the more that they will actually relax and let their tics out. I mean, this is one of the key things, is that often, you know, Alex would come home having actually ticked very little at school, and then he'd be ticking furiously at the point when he got home, because he knew he could, because he could relax, and therefore all the tics he'd been sort of trying not to let out during the day would then, you know, it's like, I mean, it sounds silly to say they store them up, but to some extent they do. The nervous energy is stored up, and then it kind of comes out.
It needs to be released somehow, doesn't
Yeah.
it? And you know, again, it reminds me a lot of meltdowns as well, especially in autism. Kind of, if there's been a lot of masking during the day, children are very, very tired, stressed, anxious, then, you know, that's when meltdown's going to happen afterwards as well. So, and it does seem a vicious circle, really, doesn't it, with all of these things of anxiety and suppression, and masking actually makes it a lot worse. Yeah.
I mean, in older children, suppression can be useful, because they can learn. One of the sort of therapeutic approaches to it is to help them to learn how to damp their tics, so that they can stop them sort of becoming full blown. And it is actually a process that for most sort of late teens, if they've still got their tics, they can actually learn a process for damping them down or for diverting them. So one of the things that I talk about is where they can learn to use a sort of competing response. So, for example, you know, if their tic is to go like that, which would actually hurt them, if they can feel the tic coming on, they could perhaps just, you know, learn how to grip their hand, or they could put their hand on their hip and just push. So the energy is still dissipated, but they don't do it in such a way that is painful.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes you just have to live with it. I mean, Angelica had a tic, which is much less of a problem now, but she had a tic where she would, when she was trying to work at her desk, she would thump the desk with the side of her hand, and she was getting bruises because, you know, she was really thumping it. And we kind of looked out for various things, and we came up with a sort of self-made protection thing, which was basically a chewy grip stuffed with bits of foam. There wasn't anything out there that was actually properly designed to make it possible. So we customized it and basically just gave her something that she could wear. And when her tics were bad, she'd put this thing on, and it just protected her when she thumped them. It didn't stop her thumping, but it stopped her hurting herself.
Yeah.
Until that tic mostly has gone away now, so it's not an issue anymore. Yeah. But if it is, she's still got the bandage in case she needs it. She also, the other thing that can often help is, I mean, I think there's two things. There's positive, and there's kind of like positive things. Like, a lot of people with Tourette's find that if they do something that they really enjoy or focus on, that might be a sport, it might be music, something that really grabs their attention in a positive way, their tics often pretty well fade away. And there are some very good examples of, you know, you can see sort of examples on YouTube of people who are obviously ticking, and they can sit down and play the piano or play the drums, and they don't tic. And as soon as they stop, within minutes, the tics come back. But for the duration of what they're doing, because they're just so focused and they're so in flow, it goes away completely. And that applies not just to creative things, but it can also apply to specific tasks. I mean, there's one of the people that I refer to is a guy who has only just recently retired. He was a surgeon.
Yeah.
Very severe adult Tourette's.
Wow. And
there's actually a lot of there's documentary footage of him. If he was in a meeting, he would tic. So if he was just looking at an X-ray, or he was in a meeting, he'd be ticking. As soon as he actually had a scalpel in his hand and a patient on the table, he stopped. and he
Amazing.
could safely perform surgery.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you have to be. And the thing was, where he worked, because he worked in rural Canada, because it was quite a small community. He was in a small town outside major cities. His patients all knew about him, so they were not worried because he was well known in the community. But he also flew a plane. He had a private pilot's license, and he could fly a plane because one of his jobs was, he had a position on the medical staffing at one of the major medical schools in Calgary, and he used to fly from his rural home base to Calgary every week, and he flew in his plane.
Yeah.
And he ticked. He was able to divert his ticking safely to fly the plane.
Yeah. You must have a lot of self-belief to go into doing those things in the first place, despite the fact that you have Tourette's.
And I mean, I think if I hadn't seen all the evidence of it and looked him up, I'd thought, really? But he's real, and he really did. And he only retired about 5 years ago. And he retired because he got to the end of his career, not because anyone made him retire.
No. Right, I'm just gonna have a look for any questions in. I think we may have one or two. Let me just quick look. Okay, so there's one from Janet here saying, how can you tell if something is a tic? I'm thinking about a child with an autism diagnosis with exaggerated, unusual facial movements when they're speaking that they're totally not conscious of. When he sees a video of himself, he gets upset and says that's not his face.
Oh. Right. I would say that facial movements that they are not conscious of at all is probably not a tic, unless they're very, very young. Most tics, the person, they can't control them, but they're aware that they're having to do it. So they have this sense of, I mean, when Alex was 6 and got his first tic, he said his eye felt irritated, which is why he was blinking. And then subsequently, as he got a bit more kind of able to express it, he was actually saying, no, it wasn't that his eye felt irritated, it's that he had a sense of irritation that he needed to blink. So he was aware that he had to blink, and he was also aware that when he blinked, it relieved that sense of needing to blink for a while. So it's very much a description of something that they have to do, and they're aware that they have to do it. So I think if somebody's totally unaware that that's what they're doing, it's not a tic in that sense, or not a Tourette, not a sort of a Tourette's tic, not a Tourette's tic.
Yes, I thought he was quite young, but actually Janet's just saying he's 8. So by that point, would you imagine that he would be aware?
I think he might not be aware that it's called a tic, but he would be aware that it's something he feels he needs to do. And that there is this kind of sense of, most kids will describe it as some sort of sense of irritation or a sense of something building up, like almost an electric feeling that they have to do it. But it's different from obsessive compulsive disorder, which is an anxiety. Because Angelica has both, and she can distinguish between them, because one is a physical sense of irritation and the other is a psychological sense of anxiety. So because one of the reasons that she was kind of somewhat misdiagnosed to begin with, because originally she was diagnosed with OCD, and it was only afterwards that we said, no, these are tics, not OCD. But she has both. But what she was, the OCD ones were things that she felt she had to do in order to make things right. And that was often something she maybe had to count, or it had to do it a specific number of times. Whereas with the tics, although they sometimes also have to repeat it, the sense is of not making it right, but until it feels right, and there is a difference.
Yes.
And they, sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to say one of my daughters has OCD, and part of that was kind of intrusive thoughts that if she didn't do certain things, that something bad was going to happen, either to her or to somebody else. Or,
yes. And I think and often they can describe that, because Alex had OCD, and when he was very young, he used to talk about scary thoughts.
Yes.
He didn't know what, he did just kind of go, scary thoughts, scary thoughts. And that's when he was very young, he was about 5. And it was only when he was older that he was able to kind of like say more about the sort of thoughts he had. But with Angelica, she's actually much, I think because hers has developed somewhat older. I think she had OCD at an early age, but she is more able now to distinguish the two.
Yeah.
But I mean, going back to, I think the little boy that Janet was talking about, I think I wouldn't say it couldn't be a tic, but it doesn't sound a typical tic. And I think it would be interesting to see whether he has any more evolve, or whether he becomes more able to actually discuss it. But the fact that he actually doesn't acknowledge it when he sees it and says it isn't his face doesn't sound like a Tourette's type tic.
There could be a disconnect, couldn't there, because actually feeling something and having to do something, but then seeing yourself doing that, it's a very different thing, isn't it? So and especially, in autism as well, there can be that kind of an issue of interoception as well. So actually knowing what it is we feel inside, or being able to put it into language, I guess, actually communicate with someone else about it.
I mean, I think the other thing is it's not clear cut that they're still not really sure whether autism and Tourette's are linked. They know that Tourette's and ADHD are linked, and Tourette's and OCD are linked. But one of the problems with diagnosing autism is that some of the classifications for things like repetitive behaviours can lead to tics being misdiagnosed as autism, but also autism being misdiagnosed as tics. So I think it's not. It's. I think the jury's out on whether or not autism is linked to OCD, which to Tourette's. It doesn't mean it can't be. Whether it's commonly linked is much less clear. Whereas it is commonly linked with ADHD, it's commonly linked with OCD.
Yeah. I know there is a school of thought that eventually all of these neurodivergences will be kind of considered to be linked and will be a spectrum of some kind. But I know there's a lot of opposition to that at the moment. I think we've had another question actually from Valderine. Saying, you mentioned that a lot of parents aren't aware of what it is. Do you know what is being done around awareness for parents, carers and teachers? It seems a lot of teachers are struggling with things coming up post-pandemic that they hadn't seen in children before. Yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, I think the answer is in terms of specific training. Now, I'm not involved in teacher training, so I don't know what's included in teacher training. But from what I've gathered from teachers I have met, not a lot, bluntly. If there are resources out there are some very good resources out there for teachers, particularly through the Tourette's charities. So Tourette's Action in the UK. Tourette organisation, Tourette, what's it called? Tourette Syndrome Association in America, and then there are similar national ones in Australia and in European countries as well. They are increasingly putting together some very good information packs, resource kits for teachers and for schools, but it's not part of the generic training, or if it is, it's barely touched upon. So I think the difficulty is it's often that the teacher has to think, is this something that I'm seeing, and then look for it. If they start looking for advice or information, it's out there, but it's not something that's going to be put in front of them. So this is one of the reasons why I wanted to make, although the book's not written for teachers, there are bits in it that are highly relevant to teachers.
Yeah.
But also, if as a parent, you know what might impact in the school, you can then take that to the teachers and say, this is what's going on. And you've got, so I wanted that to be a case that you could say, okay, this is what I think is going on. So I need to, first of all, I need to try and get a medical diagnosis. But the medical diagnosis can take an awfully long time because of the process of referral. And there's simply not enough. There's not enough. I mean, CAMHS at the moment around the country is on its knees.
Yeah.
Post-pandemic, you know, a lot of regions for any mental health conditions. You know, I mean, I've heard sort of fairly horrific stories about people not even being referred with kids who are having suicidal thoughts because CAMHS just isn't there. You know, they're down to, and so getting a medical diagnosis could take an inordinately long time. Even knowing the system, even, you know, it took us years. Didn't take us very long with Alex, but that was quite a few years ago. And in the kind of post-pandemic, with all the stuff that's come out for kids in terms of their mental health issues, it's more stretched than ever, and it's been pared back over time. You know, I could get very political, but I won't at this point. But you know, it's not going to be easy. But starting off by going forward and saying we need a medical diagnosis will kind of at least get you kind of seen, and getting your GP to make a medical diagnosis in the first instance.
Yeah.
While you're doing that, you can still get the help at school. You don't have to have a medical diagnosis, which is key. I thought you might need to. The more subtle it is, the more it helps to have a medical diagnosis. But because it could take you years, you don't want your kid halfway through secondary school having completely given up on themselves before you can actually get them any help, because really you need the help if not in primary, then certainly by the time they get to secondary school, because it can impact so much on their learning. You know, a lot of the programs about Tourette's focus on the social side, and that's obviously, in terms of kids' mental well-being, is huge, but it can also impact enormously on their learning. And in some ways, the more subtle it is, the more it can impact, because the less it's noticed. And so the kid can be, you know, scraping along the bottom, but because they work so hard at not being noticed, they just don't learn, and they don't do well, and they're just not picked up. And that was the group that I particularly wanted to try and get help for. Because they can be assessed in the school. They can be assessed in the school, and you know, applications for SEND statements, applications for access requirements for tests and exams can all be applied for by the school without having to have a medical diagnosis. If you're struggling to prove it, then obviously having a medical diagnosis gives you you know, weaponry, but you can actually say, you know, this is what we think is going on. And one of the things, you know, I just thought, if somebody just takes this book into school and just gives it to the Senko and says, read it, you know, just read this, and that's really kind of what I wrote it for, because they won't get taught it. And in fact, I was talking to a friend, who was actually my writing buddy, but she does part-time work in a school. And she works part-time in a school for kids with special educational needs. It's a specialist school, and yet they really didn't know about Tourette's. And I was really surprised that they didn't know anything about it, or they knew it existed, but they had no idea what the ramifications were.
No. I mean, you know, it's similar with a lot of children who have internal presentations, as it were, of ADHD and autism as well, and and all the others. I mean, people are struggling with dyslexia and dyscalculia and things like that. And I think it's actually quite surprising how little teachers and people in schools know. So if somebody suspects, obviously they need to set in motion by going to GP to ask for a referral, but also at the same time, would it be the Senko that they would search out within the school?
I mean, obviously, if they know a particular teacher very well, and maybe particularly at primary school, where often the additional learning support is often more informal. If you notice stuff at primary school, talk to them at primary school. I mean, Alex was diagnosed just as he was sort of coming towards the end. He was, I think, in year 5 when he was diagnosed. So when he went to secondary school, he went with the diagnosis. But Angelica wasn't diagnosed until she wasn't diagnosed with tic disorder until she was 12 and a half. She's only now been diagnosed formally with Tourette's. She's been treated as having Tourette's by the school for years because we made sure she was, but she only actually got her specialist referral this year. Now that's obviously partly because of the pandemic. It's everything got shifted, but even knowing everything, and a lot of the kids who report will say, that they've had tics since they were 5, 6, 7, 8, but they got their diagnosis in their late teens. Some of them haven't been diagnosed in their late teens. Some of them don't get diagnosed until their 20s. And that tends to be the ones who got a more severe persistent form, because obviously it carries on. And I think one of the issues is that when you look at the number of specialists, and I went via Tourette's Action to look at the directory of specialists in the UK. So I had an up-to-date sense of who's out there. This is medical specialists. There are obviously other specialists involved, but the medical specialists who will diagnose it. The number of consultants who would see under 16s, there were 22 in the whole of the UK. Of whom there was 1 in Scotland, 1 in Northern Ireland, none in Wales, a bunch in London, and then there were a few very specialist centres. Nottingham has more than 1. Birmingham has more than 1 because they're specialist research centres. But I mean, those are NHS practitioners. There are private practitioners who are. But then you've got to pay, and I've heard of a paper where they did, because the child's symptoms tics were so severe, they paid to get their kid diagnosed. Obviously is not what you would want, and not everybody can do it. But I think if you can get the educational ball rolling so that they get the support at school, and if you as a parent can really put in place the home support, and that really, it's just, I mean, the thing that I kind of say over and over again is just believe them. Just believe that this is something real. They're not making it up. They can't stop it. They're not trying to get attention. And if you can just let them be and reassure them and believe them and tell them that you believe them, that is huge. Because they have to, if they're struggling everywhere else, at least if they can come home and just relax and know that they're not going to get told off, and you may just need to make adjustments for the more disruptive tics. That's just the way it is. But I think that it and one of the things I also say is that it can be funny, and it's okay for it to be funny. I mean, one of the things with the kids on the servers is that they will tic furiously amongst themselves, and they will just, they'll just be having, breaking up with laughter because it can be hilarious. I mean, some of Angelica's tics are just hilarious. You know, she bats her father on the forehead, and sometimes it's a tic, and sometimes she's actually just doing it.
I think in the book you make the point, and actually the Tourette's themselves that are talking about it and saying that. Where was I going? I've just lost my train of thought. There you go. That's ADHD in motion. Just lost my train of thought. I was thinking about, oh yes, laughing. That was it. So the difference between laughing at somebody with a tic and laughing with them. And also I found it really interesting when you were saying about at school, sometimes, you know, the kids can be laughing at them, but also setting off the tics by kind of copying them, and that actually is a stimulus.
Yes,
for it to happen even more. That was interesting.
And I think, you know, sometimes, I mean, one of the kids who responded to the survey said that sometimes it was her friends doing it and they weren't doing it to be mean, but they were doing it because they thought the tics were cute.
Yeah.
So obviously they wouldn't do one that would make her hurt herself, but they might do a vocal tic that would make her do the same thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are some tics which when they talked about, because there was a big thing amongst some of the medical professionals that you know, were some of these tics just sort of internet based, because you could go online and you could see all these other kids ticking, and this would therefore, and was some of the people ticking not Tourette's but actually just kids who were anxious picking up tics? And the answer is some of them might well be. It's not they're putting it on, but some of the kids with tics during the pandemic were anxiety-based tics, not actual Tourette's. And in those kids, once their anxiety lessens, the tics would gradually fade away, which is one of the reasons why the Tourette's diagnosis has to be based on time. But also, if you have got Tourette's and someone else tics, then you may well end up picking up their tic. So it's quite suggestible amongst people with Tourette's. So there are certain vocal tics that seem to be very popular, because the kids will, you know, and there are some that you know, there are things people will refer to, you know, the beans one, because they all go beans, you know, or there's a kind of tic where people go, I can't even do it, but like a popping noise.
Yeah.
And they seem to do the rounds, but it's when they do it. It's when a child does it in order to make fun of.
Yeah.
It's very hurtful, particularly if it's a child that they don't know or like. You know, and Angelica had a boy. In fact, it was more with her. It was then more of it was a mixture between compulsion and a tic. But there was a little boy who would, in her class, who noticed her doing something, so he did the same thing, and he knew that it would make her do it. Stroking the table. So he'd stroke the table, and then she'd end up having to do it. And that was not done kindly.
No, that's a form of bullying, isn't it? Really, yeah. Okay, I know we've gone over 8 o'clock. I know you said you were okay if it went over a little bit. I'll just check if there are any other comments or.
Somebody called Angela. I just think, has Angela? What was it that Angela was asking? Because a lot of the comments are from Janet, but who else is on? Do we know?
Let's have a look. We've got one that just says Facebook user. So that's all that we can see.
Okay.
Support for information. Okay.
Somebody is saying, I'd love a link to share on my trust website.
Right. So is that a
NHS? Is that an NHS trust?
Yeah, but what is that for? Is that a link to the book. I think Steph's put in a link to the book on Amazon in the comments if anybody is wanting to have a link to post somewhere.
I think. I mean, I would hope that one of the things that I'm quite proud of is that the foreword for the book is written by Professor Andrea Cavana, who's based in Birmingham. He's actually he's a world expert on Tourette's, and he was very happy to endorse the book as being a good resource. So he's planning to recommend it to all his patients. Having said that, obviously the people who get to see him are already at that point in their journey. The real problem is the ones who don't get to see him or are waiting to get to see him. And I think that's the group I'm most concerned about, the ones that nobody's picked up or that are still somewhere in the process. Because I think my concern is that some of these kids are going to go through school and nobody will know that that's what the problem is. And they can come out having bombed their exams, having destroyed any self-belief, potentially socially isolated, and just thinking that they're rubbish.
Yeah.
And that's the group I really want this book to reach.
Yeah.
So I think it's, if in doubt, it's if you think there are kids in your school, or if you think there are patients that you see in some context, read it.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm saying I wrote it to get the message out. I mean, it's a byproduct if people buy it, but I really, really want people to read it, and I want people to recommend it, because I really think it matters. And I think with the book, it bridges a divide between the official books, if you like, and the kind of mummy memoirs, as I sort of describe. It's a resource that I think you can trust, but you can read it, and you can read it in a sitting and understand it, and and give it to anybody that who you think would benefit from it. And I think, for me, I took it into our school and gave it to the Senko. I gave a copy to the Senko and said, please take this away and keep it, because it's not just my daughter that you'll be dealing with. Absolutely.
Yeah. I will definitely recommend it to everyone. I'll put it on my website, and obviously we've got the link in the group, and I'll tell everybody about it, because I do think it's wonderful. And I think, it is sad that we have to, but the fact that, as you say, CAMHS is on its knees, and there's such a dearth of professionals and so on. We have to be our children's advocates, don't we, for all of these conditions. We have to educate ourselves as much as we possibly can, and then advocate for our children and fight for them. And I think this is such a good resource for that initial education, and then passing it on, like you say, take it into your school, take it, even to. Do you think how knowledgeable do you think GPs are these days? I know with ADHD, especially in girls, it's very difficult to.
I think they're not, but also, again, they're mostly aware of the more severe manifestations. And I think that the thing that I'm concerned about is that this is picked up early enough when things can be put in place.
Mm-hmm.
One of the problems, we had, she's now retired, we had a very good GP who I had a very good relationship with. But one of the things she said to me is, do you want to medicalize Alex because his symptoms are so mild? And I had in the back of my mind, because I was also in an educational position, that this could get worse, because it can, but also the implications for his education were much more important than the medical implications. So I wanted him to have a label, even though his condition might never become severe,
mm-hmm.
so that I had something to point to. And like I said to you, although it's not essential to have a medical diagnosis to get an educational statement, it helps. And when he was at school, what kind of really sort of showed it to me was that he took a couple of GCSEs a year early because his school did that for a couple of the subjects, and he didn't have any extra support. He was allowed to use a keyboard because his writing was illegible, completely illegible, but he didn't get any extra time. He didn't get any rest breaks. He didn't get a separate room. And one of the exams was very short phrases, and he got an A star. The other was long periods of continuous writing, and he got a D. Having been predicted from his coursework to get an A or a B.
Yeah.
And it was at that point that I thought that he's, and actually, it was actually at that point that I was able to say to school, you need to do something about this. And that's when they applied for the access arrangements. And we then also had something from the specialist who he by that stage been referred to, who was able to say this is a recognised part of Tourette's. And the school then actually applied for the extra things that he needed. And he went on, and in the rest of his GCSEs, with all those things in place, he got what he was supposed to get, which was, a mixture. But that was the only D he ever got. The other thing that was interesting, and I think also emphasised the need for educational support, was that by the time he got to sixth form, his tics had largely faded. You wouldn't probably have noticed them if you didn't know he had it. But he changed school out of choice. He wanted to go to a different sixth form. And at the first parents' evening, which fortunately was only a few weeks into the autumn term, one of his A-level teachers, which was in a subject that he had to write a lot, said, I don't know what's going on with Alex, but it's really frustrating because he will do an in-class assignment and he'll get a D. And then I ask him to repeat it the next day as a remedial task, and he'll get an A or a B. And I said to her, is the first test timed? Is it done under sort of exam conditions? And she said, yes. And I said, are you aware that he has access arrangements because he has Tourette's? And she went, no, it hadn't been with him. So, of course, when he came in the next day, same knowledge, but no longer under pressure, not timed, he could get it all out on paper.
Yeah.
Under exam conditions, he couldn't finish.
No.
And she, so that taught me two things. One, never believe it just travels with them, and make absolutely sure that every individual teacher knows, not just the school as a whole. Now, if you've got a good Senko, they should be able to make that clear to all the teachers, but you may still have to reinforce it. And I always check up with Angelica, do all her subject teachers know that what she has in place? Because sometimes, it's a big school. They're looking after a hell of a lot of kids, a lot of whom have different educational needs. You can't expect them all to know everything about every kid.
No.
One of the things that she also did, which she initiated, which actually came from something that one of the Tourette's influencers that I spoke to did, was that she produced a video which was things that she wanted teachers to know. And I've referenced it in the book, her video. And she just came up with a list of things that she thought it would be very, very useful for teachers to know. So I reproduced that list, and Angelica put together a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation for her teachers to present to the school, because she was too shy to do it herself, but her teachers did it as a presentation about Tourette's and Tourette's awareness.
Yeah.
And quite a few kids in the survey group said they really wished that either they would be given the opportunity to do it themselves for those who are more confident, or that it could be done at the school so that the wider school community would understand.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a great idea.
The learning side of it, and then there's obviously the social side.
Yeah. I think, you know, and obviously grades aren't the be all and end all, but at the same time, it's just about a person being able to fulfill what their potential is, isn't it? And also, you know, the self-esteem, and you know, the motivation and everything that goes down when you're just so frustrated at not being able to demonstrate what you know, really.
And I think, you know, I mean, they're not, I mean, I'm obviously coming at it as an academic, but grades not every kid is academic, but equally a kid can be academically bright but still have educational needs. And I think the group that's often suffer the most are the ones who are bright enough to cover it up to a point.
Yeah.
So it's not picked up that they are actually underperforming because they're doing okay.
Yeah.
You know, they're the middle group. But what people don't realise is they could do so much better. And if they believe that they can do so much better, it's whether or not they rule themselves out of things. You know, I mean, not every kid wants to go to university. Not every kid wants to do a particular subject. But if they do, and they don't believe they can, because nobody's realised that they need that extra support, that's the bit that I think is sad. You know, if they don't want to do those sorts of things, that they still need the support, but the grades are less of an issue.
Yeah.
But for those that want to, but just don't think they can. And also, I think because of the way our educational system is set up, anyone going through any mainstream school, they are judged by their GCSE results, or, you know, whether you like it or not. And for them to come out with less than they are capable of just seems to me to be it's a failing of the system.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, let's I think we might have to start winding down, but so it was Angela Peake who was asking about, so she's with the NHS Trust. She's a differently abled support manager. She's had to go now, but I think Steph shared the your book, and also the link to your book, and also the website for Tourette's Action as well. So Steph's put that link in the chat as well. And Valderine said, thank you for a great conversation, AJ and Dr. Mandy. We'll catch up on the rest later. So that's great. Thank you. When you're watching again later, Valderine, thank you very much for coming along and for asking your question. Okay, yeah, and Janet's saying it's demoralising for them. She's obviously talking about the schools and you know, the how difficult it is demonstrating kind of your knowledge, and, you know, when you don't have the right support. And I know my daughter, who has access arrangements as well, the clinic who diagnosed her did point out to the school that it isn't just in actual exams as well. If they're having tests, you know, throughout the year or whatever, the individual subject teachers need to know that they're supposed to have these different access arrangements.
And also often it's simple things. I mean, like for Angelica, if she gets, the more anxious she is, the more likely she is to tick, the more likely she is to really struggle with actually concentrating and writing. Yeah. So one of the things, and it sounds very, very simple, but one of the things is she calls it an emotional therapy frog. It's that, you know, it's a little plushie.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's actually listed under her access arrangements, because I wrote to the school and said, you know, I know that they're very limited in what they're allowed to take into the exam.
Yeah.
Can she take in her emotional support frog? and it's palm sized. It's just a little plushy soft toy.
Yeah.
She takes it in with her. It's in her pocket. And if she gets overwhelmed, she just clutches her little emotional support frog, and it just helps her calm down.
Yeah.
So just having that in the exam with her is, and it's the simplest of things.
Yeah.
But but as well as the access and the breaks and all the rest of it, she's got this, and she takes it in with her, and it's just there.
Yeah.
And that helps stop the anxiety building, which helps stop the tics building.
Yeah. And it just comes down to everybody being educated about this and why certain things are needed. And, we just want to get to a situation where these things are just part and parcel of being at school. And, all individuals are completely different, and different individuals need, different support or different arrangements. So let's hope we get to a point where that's the case. And I think what you're doing with your book is, such a great step in that direction.
I think it's one of the things that the kids at the end of the book said, which is we are, we don't want people to make allowances for us. We want the world to accept us as we are, because we are actually amazing, wonderful people. And we bring all sorts of talents and abilities. And actually it's time that, it's the time that the neurotypicals kind of got a life and dealt with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can sign up to that one. Well, thank you so much for coming and talking about this. I'll keep sharing away, keep telling everybody about it. And I know that one of the things you'd really like is that if anybody does purchase the book and reads it and finds it useful and informative and enjoys it, if they could write a review on Amazon, that would really help it be more visible, and more people get to know about it.
Amazon has an algorithm, and basically they need, the more reviews you get in a relatively short space of time, the higher up the listings it goes, and therefore the more people see it.
Yeah.
So when if somebody puts in a request for a book on neurodivergence or Tourette's, obviously if they're looking for Tourette's, it'll come up quite quickly. But the more reviews, yes please, the better.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I'll go straight on and I'll do that. And if people would like to contact you to find out more, what's the best thing for them to do?
I'm on LinkedIn. Just look up Dr. Mandy Barnett on LinkedIn, or I think Stephanie put in my email address, which is mandy@comptongray.com.
Yes, it's on the ticker tape that's just running underneath.
That's my email that's connected to my publishing house, which is us.
Lovely. Yeah. Lovely. Well, thank you, and congratulations on the book as well. I mean, that's a wonderful achievement. I will have another conversation with you all about actually self-publishing a book, because that's on my to-do list and I still haven't got round to it. So that would be great to talk about as well. But thank you very much.
Conversation, isn't it?
Thank you for taking the time out, and I'm sorry. Once again, apologies. It was postponed from last week.
That was
very well. But thank you for coming along tonight instead.
You're very welcome.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye.